Welcome to the darkest corners of your imagination, where fear knows no boundaries. This is Mr. Night Scare's story, the home of spine-chilling tales that will haunt your dreams. Here, the night comes alive with stories of unspeakable terror, from cursed forests to haunted houses, from lurking shadows to untold urban legends. We bring you nightmares you'll never wake up from. Are you brave enough to face what lies ahead? Once you enter, there's no turning back. Subscribe now, if you dare. And remember, every story you hear here might just be true. Mr. Night Scare's story, where fear becomes reality. Story number 1. Ward 66, the Lazarus Gate. In the quiet town of Fairmont, the St. Dymphna Psychiatric Hospital had been an imposing presence for nearly a century. Once heralded as a sanctuary for the mentally ill, it became infamous in 1994 when the entire high-security wing, Ward 66, vanished overnight. 73 patients and 12 staff members disappeared without a trace, leaving behind only cryptic writings on the walls and floors, alongside massive pools of blood. The incident was never explained, and the hospital was shut down. Over the years, St. Dymphna's decaying halls became a source of local legends. Teenagers dared each other to approach its iron gates, claiming they could hear faint screams or see shadowy figures in the windows. But no one had ever entered and lived to tell the tale. That was until investigative journalist Lila Moore decided to uncover the truth. Lila had been obsessed with St. Dymphna ever since she was a child, hearing stories from her grandfather, a former nurse at the hospital. Now, as an award-winning journalist, she saw the upcoming demolition of the building as her last chance to tell the true story behind the horrific event. "Are you sure about this?" Alex, her cameraman, asked as they stood outside the gates. "It's the opportunity of a lifetime," Lila said. "This story could redefine everything we know about that night." Joining them was Marcus Hayes, a retired detective who had worked on the initial investigation in 1994. Marcus had always felt the case was incomplete and agreed to accompany Lila in hopes of finding closure. The three climbed the rusted gates and entered the hospital grounds. The stormy night cast long, jagged shadows across the courtyard. Thunder rumbled overhead as Lila led the way inside. Inside, the hospital felt alive in its decay. The smell of mildew and rust permeated the air, and every creak of the floorboards seemed amplified. Patient files, decayed furniture, and abandoned medical equipment were strewn about as though the staff had fled in a panic. "We stick together," Marcus said firmly, his flashlight sweeping the halls. In the administrative office, Lila found a map of the hospital. A red circle marked Ward 66. Beneath it, someone had scrawled in jagged handwriting, "Do not enter. It's awake." As they approached the ward, Alex began to notice anomalies on his equipment. The camera glitched, showing brief flashes of distorted figures. "I don't like this," Alex muttered. "Then you're going to hate what's next," Marcus said, pointing to the massive steel door leading to Ward 66. The door was reinforced with rusted chains, but they had been snapped long ago. Marcus hesitated before pushing the door open. Ward 66 was colder than the rest of the hospital, and the oppressive atmosphere made it difficult to breathe. The walls were covered in symbols and phrases scratched deep into the plaster. The gate must remain closed. They entered one of the patient rooms, where a journal lay open on the bed. The entries belonged to a patient named Subject 12. "Dr. Lang says the pain will bring me closer to eternity. I hear the voices now. They speak of a gate, a passage to freedom. But freedom for who?" "Dr. Lang?" Lila whispered. "He was the head of Ward 66. Marcus frowned. "He disappeared along with everyone else." The room suddenly grew colder, and the group heard faint whispers coming from the hallway. "Please tell me that's the wind," Alex said, gripping his camera tightly. But it wasn't. Chapter 4, The Lazarus Project. At the end of the ward, they found a locked filing cabinet. Marcus pried it open with a crowbar, revealing a folder labeled The Lazarus Project. The documents described a series of experiments led by Dr. Lang, who had been attempting to merge science and the occult to unlock immortality. The experiments involved inducing near-death experiences in patients and exposing them to rituals designed to open the gate. One entry read, "Subject 12 is responding well. He hears them now. The gate begins to stir." "What gate?" Alex asked, his voice trembling. Before anyone could answer, the floor beneath them began to rumble. The group fled into the hallway as the whispers turned into guttural growls. They heard footsteps, heavy, deliberate, and turned to see a figure emerge from the shadows. It was a man in a hospital gown, his eyes hollow and glowing faintly. His skin was stretched tight over his bones, and his mouth hung open unnaturally wide. "It's one of the patients," Marcus said, pulling Lila behind him. The figure let out an inhuman scream and lunged at them. Alex swung his camera at it, but it passed through the creature as though it were made of smoke. "Run!" Lila shouted, dragging Alex down the hall. They barricaded themselves in an operating room, where they found more evidence of the experiments. An altar made of bones and a circle of melted candles surrounding a massive symbol etched into the floor. "This is the gate," Marcus said, his voice grim. Lila flipped through the documents, her hands shaking. They opened it, but they didn't close it. The room grew darker as shadowy figures began to seep through the walls. The guttural growls turned into distorted voices, each one chanting the same word. "Lazarus." "What do we do?" Alex asked, panic in his voice. Lila pointed to the altar. "If this is the gate, we need to destroy it." Marcus grabbed a rusted pipe and began smashing the altar while Lila poured a container of flammable liquid onto the symbol. The shadows screamed in unison as the room began to shake. The ground split open, revealing a swirling void beneath the floor. From the void, a monstrous figure emerged, a grotesque amalgamation of flesh, bone, and shadow. The creature reached for Lila, its hollow eyes fixed on her. Marcus stepped in front of her, swinging the pipe at its outstretched arm. "Go," he shouted. "No!" Lila cried, but Marcus pushed her toward the door. As the creature engulfed Marcus, Lila and Alex lit the altar on fire. The flames spread rapidly, consuming the symbol and the creature with it. The hospital began to collapse around them as they fled. Lila and Alex escaped just as St. Dymphna was engulfed in flames, collapsing into the ground. Weeks later, Lila reviewed the footage they had captured. In the final frames, Marcus could be seen standing in front of the altar, his eyes glowing faintly. A whisper echoed from the speakers. "The gate never closes." Story number 2. The Shadows of St. Augustine Hospital. St. Augustine General was once a bustling hospital on the outskirts of Chicago, renowned for its cutting-edge treatments and compassionate care. But in 1978, everything changed. Patients and staff began reporting strange occurrences. Shadowy figures in the halls, sudden drops in temperature, and whispers in empty rooms. The culmination of these events occurred on Halloween night, when a power outage left the hospital in complete darkness. Over 40 patients and 15 staff members were found dead, their bodies contorted in unnatural positions, their eyes frozen open in terror. The survivors, babbling incoherently, spoke only of the shadows. The hospital was abandoned shortly after, left to rot. But the legend of St. Augustine grew, drawing the curious and the brave to its haunted halls. 30 years later, a group of urban explorers set out to uncover the secrets of St. Augustine. Led by Brooke Tanner, a thrill-seeker and amateur documentarian, the team consisted of her younger brother, Noah, her best friend, Mia, and Nate, a skeptic who dismissed the paranormal as made-up nonsense. "This is our chance to make something big," Brooke said as they stood outside the towering, decrepit building. "If we can capture real evidence, we'll make history. Or become history," Nate muttered, staring at the hospital's shattered windows. Armed with cameras, flashlights, and a sense of adventure, the group entered St. Augustine. The interior of the hospital was a time capsule of tragedy. Broken gurneys and rusted floor stands littered the halls, while faded medical charts lay scattered on the floor. Graffiti covered the walls, but some of the markings looked older, like they had been scratched into the plaster with bare hands. As they explored, Brooke noticed something strange. Every window they passed showed a reflection of the group, but there were always more figures than there should have been. "Is it just me? Or are we not alone in these mirrors?" she asked, her voice shaky. Before anyone could respond, a loud crash echoed from the second floor. "Probably just the wind," Nate said, though he gripped his flashlight tighter. But when they reached the source of the sound, they found an overturned gurney in the center of the hallway. Written on the wall above it, in what appeared to be blood, were the words, "Leave now." Mia stepped back, her voice trembling. "I think we should listen." "No," Brooke insisted, pulling out her camera. "This is exactly what we're here for." The team continued deeper into the hospital, their footsteps echoing in the oppressive silence. They entered what had once been the ICU. The beds were still there, but the mattresses were torn, and the smell of decay lingered. Noah pointed to a clipboard hanging from one of the beds. "Look at this." It was a patient file dated October 31st, 1978. The patient, Abigail Grant, had been admitted for severe burns but had no recorded discharge. Scrawled across the bottom of the file was a single word, "Consumed." "What does that mean?" Noah asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Before anyone could answer, the temperature in the room plummeted. The lights on their cameras flickered, and the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to stretch and grow. "Do you feel that?" Mia asked, shivering. Then, a low, guttural growl filled the air. Panicking, the group fled the ICU and found themselves in a narrow stairwell leading to the basement. Despite every instinct telling them to leave, Brooke insisted they press on. "This is where the truth is," she said. The basement was worse than the floors above. The walls were damp, the air thick and suffocating. They found themselves in a long corridor lined with doors. Each door had a small window, but whatever was inside was obscured by darkness. One door stood out. It was larger than the others and marked with a rusted plaque that read "Restricted Access." Mia hesitated. "I don't like this." Brooke pushed the door open. Inside, they found a room unlike anything they had seen before. At its center was a large, circular symbol carved into the floor, surrounded by extinguished black candles. Symbols were scrawled across the walls, along with the phrase, "They feed on fear." "What is this?" Nate asked, taking a cautious step forward. Brooke knelt by the symbol, running her fingers over the grooves. "I think it's some kind of ritual. Maybe they summoned something." As she spoke, the shadows in the room began to move, pooling into the center of the symbol. A figure emerged, a towering, featureless shape with glowing red eyes. The group froze as the figure let out a bone-chilling scream. The entity lunged at Noah, its elongated limbs reaching out with impossible speed. He screamed as it pulled him into the darkness, his voice fading as if swallowed by the void. "Noah!" Brooke cried, but there was nothing she could do. The remaining three ran, but the hospital was no longer the same. Hallways stretched endlessly, doors slammed shut on their own, and the lights from their flashlights barely pierced the darkness. Mia tripped and fell. Before Brooke could help her, the shadows engulfed her, dragging her into the floor. "Brooke, we have to get out of here," Nate shouted. But Brooke wasn't listening. She was staring at the mirrors lining the hallway, where her reflection was no longer her own. Brooke and Nate found themselves back in the ritual room, though they hadn't meant to return. The entity stood in the center, its hollow gaze fixed on them. "You brought us here," Brooke said, her voice trembling. The entity didn't respond with words, but Brooke heard it in her mind. "We are eternal. You are fuel." Realizing they couldn't escape, Brooke grabbed a broken piece of glass and carved into the symbol on the floor, disrupting its perfect shape. The entity screamed, its form flickering. The shadows recoiled, and the hospital began to shake violently. "Brooke, let's go," Nate yelled. But as the entity lunged for them, Brooke pushed Nate out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Nate made it out of St. Augustine just as the building collapsed, consumed by a sinkhole. Weeks later, he received an email from an unknown sender. Attached was a video of Brooke, standing in the ritual room. Her eyes were glowing red, and her voice was distorted as she said, "The shadows never leave." Story number 3. The Haunting of St. Mercy Hospital. Nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains, St. Mercy Hospital was once a sanctuary for those in need of healing. It operated as both a general hospital and a sanatorium during the tuberculosis outbreaks of the early 20th century. But rumors swirled of unethical experiments conducted on the dying, and in 1948, a catastrophic fire engulfed the hospital, killing patients and staff alike. The hospital was abandoned, left to crumble into ruin. Locals avoided the area, swearing they could hear faint screams or see figures in the windows. It became a forbidden place, known as the Void to those brave enough to speak of it. Now, 75 years later, paranormal investigator Riley Hart and her team planned to uncover the truth behind the hospital's dark past. Riley's team included her tech-savvy best friend, Sam, ex-military medic Ethan, and Elise, a medium with a knack for sensing spirits. They arrived at St. Mercy under the cover of twilight, the hospital looming like a skeletal beast against the purple sky. "Looks like something out of a nightmare," Sam said, setting up their equipment. "That's why we're here," Riley replied, her voice steady, "to find out what really happened." Elise closed her eyes as they crossed the threshold. "There's something waiting," she murmured. Inside, the air was heavy, the silence oppressive. Wheelchairs lay overturned, medical charts scattered across the floor. The walls bore scorch marks from the fire, but the damage didn't hide the cryptic symbols carved into the plaster. "What's with the carvings?" Ethan asked, tracing a symbol with his flashlight. "They're protection runes," Elise said, her face pale. "But they're broken." As they explored the hospital, strange phenomena began almost immediately. Doors slammed shut on their own. Faint whispers echoed through the halls, and cold spots sent shivers down their spines. In the East Wing, Riley's EMF reader spiked. "We've got activity," she said. The group paused, listening. A distant scream tore through the silence, followed by the unmistakable sound of dragging footsteps. "Tell me that's one of you," Sam whispered. They followed the sound to a long, dark hallway. A single wheelchair stood in the middle, its wheels squeaking faintly. As they approached, it began to move, slowly at first, then hurtling toward them. "Move!" Ethan shouted, yanking Riley out of the way. The wheelchair crashed into the wall and fell silent. "Whatever's here doesn't want us here," Elise said, her voice trembling. Determined to find answers, the team located the hospital's basement. The air grew colder with each step they descended, and the smell of burnt flesh became overwhelming. They found the records room, where charred files were stacked haphazardly. Riley dug through the remnants until she found a folder labeled Project Mercy. Inside were detailed accounts of experiments conducted on terminal patients, attempts to trap their souls and extend life using occult rituals. "This can't be real," Sam said, reading over Riley's shoulder. "It's worse than we thought," Riley replied. Before they could process the information, the lights on their equipment flickered. A low growl emanated from the shadows, and a figure emerged. A nurse in a charred uniform, her hollow eyes fixed on them. The team ran, but the figure pursued them, gliding eerily above the ground. Elise stopped abruptly, turning to face the spirit. "You have to let us go," Elise shouted, her voice echoing in the corridor. The spirit didn't listen. It lunged at Elise, its skeletal hands reaching for her throat. Elise screamed as she was lifted off the ground, her body convulsing violently. "Help her!" Riley yelled. Ethan charged forward, swinging a metal rod at the spirit. The impact did nothing, but the distraction allowed Elise to fall to the ground, gasping for air. "It doesn't want us to leave," Elise whispered. "It's not going to get what it wants," Riley said, helping her up. The group followed the symbols carved into the walls, which seemed to guide them to a large, sealed door in the West Wing. With great effort, they forced it open and discovered the hospital's old chapel. At the center of the room was an altar surrounded by blackened candles and more runes. Above it, written in what looked like blood, were the words, "The bridge is open." "What bridge?" Sam asked. "A bridge between life and death," Elise said. This is where they performed the rituals. Suddenly, the room grew darker, and the candles reignited on their own. The air filled with the sound of chanting, and shadowy figures began to materialize. "We need to leave," now Ethan said. "No," Riley said, grabbing a nearby metal cross. "If we don't stop this, it'll never end." Elise began chanting a protective incantation, her voice shaking but determined. The spirits screamed, their forms flickering as the room shook violently. The lead spirit, the nurse, appeared again, her face now twisted into a mask of rage. She lunged at Riley, who held up the cross. The spirit recoiled, but the other shadows began to close in. "Keep them off me," Elise shouted as she continued the ritual. Ethan swung his rod at the shadows, while Sam used a UV flashlight to push them back. Riley joined Elise at the altar, reciting the incantation with her. The symbols on the walls began to glow, and a blinding light filled the room. The spirits screamed one final time before disintegrating into ash. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and the room fell silent. "We did it," Riley said, her voice filled with relief, but Elise shook her head. "Not entirely. The bridge is closed, but the curse is tied to this place. It'll never be free." As they exited the hospital, the first rays of dawn broke over the mountains. The building seemed less menacing in the light, but they knew the darkness would always linger. Back at their headquarters, Riley reviewed the footage. Most of it was corrupted, but one frame stood out, a close-up of the nurse's face. Beneath her hollow eyes was a faint smile, as if she knew they'd be back. And in the background, barely visible, was a single phrase carved into the wall. "We are waiting." Story number 4. Room 402. The Cursed Ward. Riverview State Hospital in rural Ohio was a sprawling psychiatric facility built in the 1920s. Known for its controversial treatments and overcrowded wards, it closed in 1985 after a string of unexplained deaths. The most infamous part of the hospital was Ward C, specifically Room 402, where patients and staff reported terrifying phenomena: phantom screams, objects moving on their own, and the feeling of being watched. The final straw came when a nurse, Annie Caldwell, was found dead in Room 402, her body unnaturally contorted and her eyes gouged out. Her death was never explained, and the hospital was shuttered shortly after. Locals warned against going near the decaying building, claiming anyone who entered would never leave the same. For thrill-seekers Ryan, Kelsey, and Mike, Riverview State was the ultimate challenge. Urban exploration was their shared hobby, and Riverview's dark history made it irresistible. "We have to check out Room 402, Ryan said, grinning as they approached the towering, ivy-covered building under the cover of night. "Why not stick to the safer wards?" Kelsey asked, hesitating as they crossed the threshold into the hospital's eerie silence. Mike shrugged, adjusting his backpack filled with cameras and EMF detectors. "We're here to find the truth, right? Let's not chicken out now." As they moved through the crumbling corridors, their flashlights barely penetrated the darkness. The peeling paint and rusted wheelchairs were unnerving enough, but it was the oppressive stillness that set them on edge. "This place feels wrong," Kelsey whispered. "You're just psyching yourself out," Ryan replied. But even he couldn't shake the sensation of unseen eyes following them. The trio reached Ward C, marked by a faded sign hanging from the ceiling. The air grew colder as they entered, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed through the halls. Mike's EMF detector began to beep erratically. "We're definitely not alone here," he said, trying to mask his unease. As they approached Room 402, Kelsey spotted graffiti scrawled on the walls. "Turn back." Below it, someone had scratched into the plaster. "She never left." "Who's she?" Kelsey asked, her voice trembling. Ryan shrugged. "Probably just some urban legend to scare people." But when they opened the door to Room 402, it was clear the stories were no exaggeration. Room 402 was unlike the other rooms they'd passed. The air was icy, and the walls were covered in deep scratches, as if someone had clawed at them with bare hands. The single bed in the corner was stripped bare, its metal frame warped and bent. On the floor, A circle of blackened candle stubs surrounded a pile of ash. A faint, metallic smell lingered in the air. "This isn't just a room," Mike said, setting up his camera. "It's a ritual site." Kelsey's flashlight flickered, and the beam landed on a message scrawled across the far wall. "Help me." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind them. Ryan rushed to the door, pulling at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. "What the hell?" he shouted, panic rising in his voice. Kelsey screamed as her flashlight flew out of her hand, smashing against the wall. The room was plunged into near darkness, save for the faint glow of Mike's camera. "Stay together," Mike said, his voice shaking. A guttural whisper filled the room, growing louder and more insistent. "Why are you here?" The circle of ash on the floor began to swirl, and the temperature dropped further. A shadowy figure emerged in the corner, its form twisting unnaturally. Its face was obscured, but its hollow, glowing eyes locked onto Kelsey. She froze, unable to move as the figure lunged at her, its claw-like hands reaching for her throat. "Get away from her!" Ryan shouted, throwing a chair at the entity. The chair passed through it, shattering against the wall. The entity let out a deafening shriek and vanished, leaving the room in silence once more. Shaken but determined, the trio searched the room for clues. Under the bed, they found a leather-bound journal belonging to Annie Caldwell, the nurse who had died in room 402. The entries revealed a chilling tale. Annie had been assigned to care for a violent patient named Margaret Doyle, who claimed to hear voices telling her to kill. When Margaret died unexpectedly during a restraint procedure, her spirit lingered, growing angrier with time. Annie described shadowy apparitions and violent outbursts in the ward, culminating in her belief that Margaret had possessed the room itself. "The ritual," Kelsey said, pointing to the circle on the floor. "She tried to banish Margaret but failed. And now we're stuck here with whatever she unleashed," Ryan muttered. The group decided to replicate Annie's ritual, hoping to banish Margaret's spirit for good. Using salt from their supplies, they recreated the circle and lit a few candles they'd found in a nearby room. Elise read the incantation from Annie's journal aloud. As the final words left her lips, the room shook violently. The shadowy figure reappeared, more solid than before. "Finish the ritual," Mike shouted as the entity lashed out, knocking him to the ground. Ryan and Kelsey joined hands, chanting the incantation again and again. The entity screamed, its form distorting as the circle glowed with an intense white light. Suddenly, the spirit of Annie Caldwell appeared, her face serene yet determined. She stepped into the circle, confronting Margaret's spirit. "Be gone," Annie commanded, her voice echoing with power. The shadow shrieked one last time before disintegrating into ash. The door to room 402 creaked open, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. Exhausted but alive, the group stumbled out of the hospital just as the first rays of dawn broke over the horizon. As they reached their car, Kelsey turned back and saw Annie's spirit standing in the window of room 402, watching them. "She saved us," Kelsey said, her voice thick with emotion. "But the hospital is still cursed," Ryan replied. "We barely made it out." They vowed never to return, but the experience would haunt them forever. Months later, Ryan received a package with no return address. Inside was a photograph of room 402, taken before their visit. In the corner of the image, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes could be seen, watching. "She never left." The end.